In lecture 5, we're going to get started talking about how to actually go about composing and structuring the essay or the student paper that you are going to write. So for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to recap the basic structure of a student essay or paper. And the reason I'm talking about the student essay or paper differently from an academic article or another kind of paper is because really they're different genres. And we want to make sure we know we are meeting the expectations for this specific kind of assignment. We're going to discuss specific strategies for composing introductions, for working on topic sentences, for dealing with conclusions, and also we'll talk about counterarguments and rebuttals. The next lecture will delve a lot more deeply in how do I develop a point within my body paragraphs, but we'll save that for later. So just so that we're clear, the genre of student essays, you've probably written them in high school, maybe even middle school. You might say, what's the point? It's kind of formulaic, it's a little bit boring. You're not wrong. That's true in many ways. But I like to look at it as this is a space to figure out if I had to make one clear point, one clear argument, how would I structure my thinking and my words to make it very clear what I was trying to express? So when you are working on a student essay, you're really working on challenging yourself to say, how well can I synthesize research by thinking critically? How well can I pick out one idea and support and sustain it through a whole argument? How can I give support with evidence, with examples? Can I think of really interesting examples to use to support it? How well can I acknowledge other versions of ideas? How can I explain why my position is the better position amongst all those out there? It's just a chance for you to really practice composing that and making that one point. Because when we're having conversations with our friends, maybe that's very learned and very high level intellectual conversations, but our ideas go up and down here and there. We don't always work on just sustaining that one point across a whole argument. So that's what we're trying to do here. And every point, or every paragraph of this student essay that you're going to compose is going to fit into a larger puzzle of trying to really make that point or express that idea. So let's look at the structure of a student essay at a very high level general way. Of course, you begin with your introduction. You always need to introduce it, and you usually end with your main point, your thesis statement. And then you have body paragraphs that really go slowly, break down everything so that the reader is completely aware of what you're saying. Because unlike whenever you're having a conversation, the listener can ask you clarifying questions, but the person who's reading your piece, you are not going to be there to explain it. So you have to do the best job you can at going one point at a time, giving a lot of explanations and illustrations, and then really saying more than you think you need to. And then, of course, you end with your conclusion, and I like to call this the place where we zoom out, and I'm going to explain what that means. But these are like a chain. What are the links in the chain? And that is the topic sentence. It's where you get to remind the readers, how is this paragraph connected to this? What is that way that you're going to explain and transition from one to another? So those are important elements of the paper. I have this also for you. It's a much more detailed explanation of the structure of a student essay, and I'm going to leave it here for you as a resource. This is a very, very great visualization of how to think about the structure. So go back and look at this when you have an opportunity. So let's jump right in. I want to start by talking about introductions. A lot of students are very intimidated by the concept of the introduction. They think like in high school, you need to have an interesting hook and you've got to really get the readers in. Well, the thing is about the student essay is your professor's going to read it one way or the other. And so I have some very specific ideas for how to get started on that. Instead of worrying, like, how am I going to make this interesting? Just keep it simple. Do not be afraid to just go ahead and say, just start where the topic is. You're just going to say, what is this going to be about? And you want to be as specific as possible. and you want to avoid talking about something you don't know about. So a lot of students, let's imagine that they're writing an essay about something about popular music, and in my 101 classes, students often write about the music that they like the most, and they argue for why other folks should listen to certain albums. And instead of starting off, talking about hip hop in the 2010s, if they're going to be writing about Drake, for example, they begin their introductions with, music has been an important element in human lives since the beginning of time. Well, that's not something you know much about. If you haven't studied the relationship between early man and music, don't start from the beginning of time. Just feel free to start right in 2010 with Drake, for example. The end of your introduction should also be where you state your main point, which is your thesis statement. So I have an example here, and I'm going to leave it here for you to look at in the slideshow, but I want to read just the very beginning and then the thesis statement. So the first sentence is, Instagram has become a medium for self-expression. However, when advertising and monetizing appearance, the users of the application have glorified thin white women as the societal beauty standard. So we begin right away. We know that her essay is going to be about Instagram, and it's going to have something to do with beauty standards and specifically women. So let's look down here at her main thesis. On Instagram, the body positivity movement, while a relatively new concept, has the potential to improve the self-conceptualization in women through concepts such as fitspiration and fashion. So here's what I like about this. It starts talking about the app that she's going to be writing about immediately. But it doesn't give us useless information. A lot of students want to say it's been around since 2000 and whatever, it has this many users. That's not really relevant to the issue, to the thesis statement that she's writing about, which is this idea of the body positivity movement. She begins discussing the topic of her paper very quickly. So she begins right here talking about this beauty standard, and then she ends with her thesis. So these are elements that I really like about this, and you are welcome to return to this again in the slides or this video to take more of a look at it. So let's talk about counterarguments. So you have your introduction, and then you have body paragraphs where you're making all of your points. And a counterargument is going to be one or fit into one of those body paragraphs. So what is a counterargument? Well, it's going to be a paragraph or two, or a part of a paragraph in your essay that says, I know that people might think differently than what I am writing about. You're acknowledging other opinions or other arguments. And usually it comes after you've written all of the paragraphs that explore your major points, and then you say, well, here's what some other people are going to say. Why would you spend time in your essay talking about what other people have to say? Well, it builds credibility because it makes you seem like you know what's going on. You are aware of other opinions, and it makes you more fair-minded. But it also reflects literal reality. The idea of asking someone to make one point for a whole paper is not very close to reality, because we all know that these points that we're making can be easily countered by other folks. So it shows what's really happening in the world, which is that there's not just one easy way to conceive of something. And it also helps you realize, okay, well, this might be a counterargument, but how can I think of a way to respond to that counterargument that might be an additional reason that you can make the readers accept what you're trying to say? So how do you respond to a counterargument? Well, you have to write a rebuttal or a concession. So a concession is where you say sometimes, actually, yes, my opponents have the better idea here, and I need to acknowledge that. However, you're going to not accept the entire thing. You'll have to accept parts of it because you are making the argument in your favor. So the concession is just explaining why you still need to, your argument still needs to be accepted, even though there are going to be some downsides. You might say, I can see that there are going to be some problems, but my position is still good. And a rebuttal is where you say, well, you know what? My opponent has this counter argument, but it's actually not a very good argument against my thoughts. So you defend your own position. So let's look at an example. In one of my students' papers, the thesis was that Instagram provides a community of diverse people for the support and aid during recovery of eating disorders through hashtags, lives, and posts. So this was one in which she was saying Instagram is actually a good force for people who are recovering from eating disorders. Well, you can imagine that the counter arguments to that are going to be a lot, because while, yes, you might find a positive community of folks in Instagram who are also going through eating disorder recovery, you might also find inspiration to continue your eating disorder, or you might find negative experiences where people are being hurtful in the comments about your body, and it might trigger your need to resist eating or resist doing the things you need to in order to stay healthy. And so this person had a counter argument that I want to improve quite a bit, but it begins the conversation. So she says, this was her counter argument paragraph. Many people like to argue that Instagram promotes eating disorders and allows the body image dysmorphia and push to continue to stay unnourished to creep in and slowly become an even bigger problem. That is absolutely a counter argument. Now, she says, although this is true, so she has a concession. She says Instagram is also a place that can help put an end to this. So she begins to do this work, and I would have a lot of comments for how we can make that even more effective. But this is kind of an example of what it means to do a counter argument and a rebuttal. So how do you develop counter arguments? Well, ask yourself, if I have this idea, if this is my thesis statement, if this is my argument, what would people against that have to say? And just brainstorm, what would they disagree with? Maybe you ask yourself, what might be some harms that even if my position is correct, there are necessarily still some problems that might come about. Maybe you say, if a person accept your position, if everybody decided to do what you said or believe what you suggested, what might be one problem that came up as a result of that on the either short or long term? Or what is something that your position does not take into consideration, that it leaves out? Or maybe other questions that might arise. And then once you've decided, well, here's what someone would say who is against my position, then you have to develop a rebuttal. How are you going to reply? Because you have to respond so that you continue to have a powerful position in your paper. Well, you answer, why is your position still the better one? Why is it still stronger? There might be merits to the opposing view, but what's still good about yours? What about the opposition is important to notice? And then, is there a way that you can compromise between your two? What might that look like? And in other words, how would you respond to what other people have to say? So moving on to conclusions, I think that a conclusion is best when it does not repeat everything that you just said in the first part, but it does something different. So in your high school, often my students will say that high school teachers just ask their students to summarize everything they just said in the introduction and the body paragraphs as a conclusion. I disagree with that because it's redundant. You've already said it. And if you're reading it, you can always go back and reread it. So I think a conclusion needs to do something different. It needs to take what you've been saying and say, how does this pertain to something larger? It needs to zoom out. So you can ask yourself the following questions to get ideas for how you might zoom out. So you've been talking about one point very strictly all throughout your paper. And then I want you to pause and say, well, how does what I'm saying in this small context have any importance on something bigger? What does this pertain to larger? What might all of this mean for a future? How could I think about what point I'm trying to make and how it might connect to a greater context? How does this relate to other issues? And the conclusion is also a place to say, okay, I've been saying all this. Now, here's what I hope happens, or here's a recommendation. So you're taking the time to not just to be redundant and summarize what you said in the beginning, but to open up the conversation to larger issues. So here's what a student essay would look like. You introduce, where you zoom in and say, here's the narrow idea I'm going to be talking about for this paper, and here's the one specific issue I'm trying to argue. Your body paragraphs systematically explain all of those points. So you're really zoomed in. And then your conclusion says, well, now that I've kind of supported this point, let's see, how does this affect a larger thing? How does this affect your life? What's important? What's the biggest deal about this? And that's when you zoom out. So next lecture, we'll talk more specifically about the ways that you do that work of making that point in the paragraphs. But for now, hopefully you have some ideas for how to get started on the other parts of the structure of your argument paper.